That is so bizarre. Danny and I were having our pre-meeting here literally 5 seconds ago, and then Peter and Mark just magically appear instantly. You guys are impeccable with timing. Look at that, Danny. We're out of the room for a second, and suddenly they're here.
It's magic. It's called Zoom. Hey,
It,
Mark,
it is a magic. Hang on, my window's a bit messed up. View.
Jonathan, Brandel, Peter, good to see you
Hi.
all.
Hello.
Oh,
How are
Danny,
you?
while we're waiting, I forgot, since Brandel is here, Brandel and Fabienne and I managed to have a 10-minute session on the headset for three, so it was three people for a few minutes. It is a
Mm-hmm.
different experience, so we should definitely try to get whoever has the vision in on a longer call. It is, when there's two, it can sometimes be a little intense, you know? So it helps to have like a little offset people, but yeah. Hello, Brandel and Fabienne, who are marked with very boring typefaces.
I meant to
Ah.
tell you, Frodo, I get my new Apple Watch this week.
Oh, what do you
This
mostly
one
use it
broke.
for?
Oh, I use it for running and exercise.
That makes sense.
It's my I mean it's like a Fitbit for me.
I have this rule that I run 15 minutes every day, and if I don't do it one day, then I have to make up the next day with another 15 minutes. So tomorrow I'm scheduled to run for 3 months.
I saw that on Threads. You stole it. That's not yours.
It's not mine at all, but I managed to say it correctly for the first time.
Fabienne, good morning.
Hello, hello. How are you doing?
Oh, fine.
Yeah,
Take you
so
back home.
boom. So while we're waiting for the Bernstein, hi Jamie.
Hi.
Hi, Jamie.
Oh,
Good to see you,
hi, Dini.
Carl.
Hi, Frode.
Jamie,
Hi, everyone.
did you get to see the app? The
I tried it for a little bit, but I'm deep in marking. I've missed. Yeah. I can't say what else I've dropped because it's being recorded, but it's not pleasant.
I was just going to ask on what. So, what's Mark going to talk about today? So, I sort of.
Uh, good
It was the
question.
camera thing, wasn't it?
Let's see. I'm going to go on our website and look at our program.
augmented self. He's been talking about the augmented self.
Yes, and he did a Blue Skies paper
Right.
at
Not
Hypertext
really
about that.
Yeah.
excellent paper at Hypertext about it.
So, well, I think Jamie's probably known him longer than I have, but Mark's been something of a fixture of the Hypertext community well since the Hypertext conference started, at least. And is probably best known to the wider world through him taking on custody of the of StorySpace, which was an early hypertext app mainly used for writing, and at the time, and this is before the web, so it was one of the main tools for writing hypertexts, and to a certain extent is now maintained because there is this back canon of work that was written for and works in StorySpace, although it's now merged with his current tool Tinderbox, which I've used now, gosh, since 2004 myself as my primary workspace. So Mark's background is sort of liberal arts. He was a Swarthmore alum, roughly contemporaneous, I think, with Andy Van Dam, a bit after Ted Nelson, but sort of from that same catchment. And Mark's work, most of the last sort of two and a half decades, has been in a tool called Tinderbox, which is a router hypertext tool, but it's also a general noting tool, which does allow for very free form expression. Obviously, it predates the sort of domain we've been looking at recently. But in fact, a paper I did with, or rather, Mark did with me as one of the secondary authors this summer, was in fact looking at the notion of the information city, which was an idea from the 1990s about using an architectural space as a way, as an information exploration space. And that was implemented in a 3D view within Tinderbox. But it would be interesting also to see how that works in the wider VR sense. One of the ideas was that you essentially would wander around a town, and just as you might serendipitously discover the, I don't know, the language quarter or the science quarter, you might, by the juxtaposition of the buildings, which represent the notes in the underlying hypertext, you might see associations you wanted to make more concrete. So it sort of sits close to the idea of the memory palace, but coming perhaps from another place. Mark is probably one of the more sort of wider read people I note, so you won't be surprised to see when he presents references from all over, very much across the sciences and the arts. I don't really know quite what else in particular there is to say.
Mark, I would say he's also experimented with a lot of other software. I have in my collection Web Squirrel.
Yeah.
I've got an early HyperCard, HyperGate. I can't tell which it is, for a way to make an early calendar. It was an early calendar software. I've got that in my collection. Sarah Smith donated that to me.
Yeah, and his tool has also been has also encountered. I mean, since then, for instance, Tinderbox tool, so things like the Information City View. So he's constantly experimenting with new ways of presenting information. His main tool, as it happens, has its primary storage underneath is an outline, simply because you really have to have something. But it can be presented in all sorts of ways. And true to its hypertextual roots, the one thing it tries to avoid being is totally linear, which is where most of our textual tradition comes from. So it's very interesting in that, because linearity lies heavily upon us and often is an impediment to actually, when you're trying to understand a subject, the inherent linearity of our tools can be difficult. Peter, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on Tinderbox a little bit. It's my main tool, and I often use it as a customized anything editor. So I'm using it as a structure editor, and when I'm having to deal with outputting a complex file format, be it LaTeX or source input for a parser generator, Tinderbox allows me to offload all of the mental work of formatting my output for whatever the grammar specifications are of the system that I'm sending the data out to. And instead, I'm able to create high-level abstractions in the Tinderbox outline with attributes, and then I fill in the relevant attributes. And that's all I need to think about when I'm working, because I'll have built into my system of templates and agents all of the mental labor of figuring out, okay, when these attributes are such and such, that's going to change how it's going to have to be formatted in generating code for the PEG parser generator. There are like 4 different ways that you can express repetition. And when I'm doing a grammar by hand, I'm having to constantly punch up the documentation for the PEG repetition. Instead, in Tinderbox, I have an attribute called cardinality. And my cardinality options are 1, 0 or 1, 1 or more, and between, to and from, or exactly count. So I just fill in the numbers, and then my code based upon that, and whether or not I want to have a delimiter marking off the individual occurrences, and then I have a trailing delimiter attribute where the trailing delimiter can be optional or it can be mandatory. So I set what my configuration is there, and then that determines which of the 4 different forms of syntax I need to admit from the grammar generator, and I don't need to think about any of that. Instead, I'm just thinking at the high-level outline of where I want to go. And then I can also use Tinderbox to effectively create macros on top of the parser.
So it's in a way, it sits, I mean...
So it's basically giving me the equivalent of a Lisp macro system on top of the frozen grammar for the parser generator.
And I think of all the sort of prototyping work, for instance, that Fabian does. I mean, in a way, it's a very free form substrate for experimentation. If you're doing mainly text-based work, is another way of looking at things. It's sort of easy to make too much of any one particular thing. But what I found interesting is using what is at one level a writing tool, but which is very free form. So I'm allowed to break the bounds of the page, which is otherwise a constraint. Dini.
Yeah, I was going to say, another thing that he did, the book Writing Space by J. David Bolter is a linear book criticism, one of the first about hypertext, seminal text. Mark Bernstein turned that into a hypertext, right? So it's on a little floppy disk that you could buy with the book. He sold the book and the floppy. He also published Writing on the Edge, which was a Michael Joyce piece that had an interesting kind of multivocal perspective to it. So he's done a lot of very interesting experiments with the textual environment, not just software, but also, being able to do like bookware, like looking at bookware. And Writing Space came out in 1991, so it's about that time period. I guess he's not coming, Rhoda.
There may be an issue, and I just typed here in the sidebar. We have such great Bernstein and Tinderbox and StorySpace understanders and experts here, and hypertext experts. There's been a lot over the last year of spatiality of knowledge. Peter's talked about memory palace type things. Vint Cerf talked about what he did in the 90s with virtual libraries where this is there and that's there. I thought about some of it earlier today, where one thing that is for sure, a knowledge shape in XR will be very personalized, and it will not be the so-called physical shape that'll be the final thing. It'll probably be the interactions and the connections, right? So with this esteemed group of brains we have here, it will be really interesting to hear some of your thoughts and dreams as a kickoff of StorySpace into how you see knowledge in space, both as a shape and as a full environment, as an interaction. I don't know. What do you think? I have a feeling Jamie's got thoughts on this. Jamie, the muted one. The great muted one. Still the muted one. Are you talking to us or someone else, Jamie?
You're muted. Bro, you should be able to unmute him by going to the little three buttons on the top of his right side of his
I can
window.
ask him to unmute, but I cannot actually do it.
I would guess that given that he has headphones around his neck but not on his
Yeah,
head, that he may be
I
speaking
agree.
to somebody in his office.
Yeah. So I will then see if anyone else has thoughts on this, because I know you all do. Who wants to speak?
Well, if you think about how text is presented in a book, it's already structured, right? We've fallen into the use of paragraphing, periods, punctuation, indentation. All of that came about as the book, was developed over time, right? Indexes, all of that came over the 500 years, 600 years of text and print. And so now the next question is, what is it going to look like for the virtual environment? Does it have to follow the print conventions? Is there a new way of thinking about text? Or are we going to continue imposing print-based mentality on an environment that's not print? That's the question, right?
I think I've got it working now. It's it was in a completely different app, so I was trying to find the window and it was in a different app. The thing about print is that we're used to print. We've we're raised in a print culture, and we have so many conventions from print that just seem natural in a way, but they're not. Of course, nothing is natural. They're and the conventions are very restrictive. We all know when we go to write something, we never start from the beginning and work our whole way through. And we never even start with one part and complete that part and then do another part and figure out where they go. So it's going to be very exploratory. And I think we have to consider what the different purposes are. So Kathy Marshall and Frank Shipman talked in some of their work, what was it called? Before the deluge or something. They talked about using spatial hypermedia for information triage, which is very personal. It depends very much on, it's personal in the sense that it depends on individual differences and the way people conceive information and perceive information, and how they put things together, and then how they would work in small groups together. So that's different than a teacher preparing something to present to a class, for instance, or a presentation that someone would give to a conference of experts. And I think with the VR, with the XR, it's going to be even more different. It's not just how we perceive things visually and spatially with depth, but how we would think about organizing things and how we would suddenly switch from one view to another. I remember a few years ago, I showed some friends of mine who aren't Macintosh users the new Finder views that Apple had, which were new some years ago. And I was saying, this is just amazing. Look, I can do this and I can do this and I can see it this way or I can see it this way. And they looked at me, and these are very smart people, one of whom works with computers every day, and said to me, we don't know what you're trying to show us. But to me, it made such total sense. And speaking of the visual making sense, before I take Froda's comment or question, I want to say how fascinating it is to see which books people have facing outwards on their shelves. It says so much to me. Froda, you had a comment or question?
I had a comment and a question, and all of those good things, and that is, while we now look at non-framed stuff, I think we should also look at framed stuff. For instance, going through editing the volume of the book, and if you haven't contributed a piece, you really should. A two-page spread, to me, seems a very human size. Not necessarily from print, but it is enough that your eyes can skip across. You don't have to move your head a lot. It seems okay for many purposes. One of the things, so Fabian, I'm going to ask you actually if we can do this. Peter, for instance, has been very prolific. He's written 4 pieces. Some of them are very, very long, which is, of course, in digital form, incredibly worthwhile. In paper, it's a bit more complicated. But if we do something as basic as show 2-page spread and then another one next to each other, but if there's more than 2 pages for one article, they are behind. So you get a sense of Peter has written a short piece here, and this one, there's a stack of things behind it, right? And the reason I'm talking about this is page layouts have meaning. You know, where you choose, if you choose to have an indent, if you choose to have different things, it has meaning. So I think we should value that as well as utterly throw it away. If you look at the link of what Fabienne has submitted for the book at the top of our chat list, in this context, it's a complete and utter mess. But of course, when you view it in the headset, it isn't. So all I'm trying to say, going in both directions, valuing exactly, Fabienne is saying, and it's his mess, which is the whole point, like with the information triage. So to be able to go between these views is really, really important. It's just no babies should necessarily be thrown out with any bath water. While at the same time they should. Yeah, Mark.
I think the interesting thing is how we move forward from working only in the structure of the page, which is to a certain extent where we're mired now. So we moved very quickly from paper to digital facsimile page, but we're still rather stuck in that. It's really interesting, for instance, that the W3C basically has no real setup to do things like citation. There are tags, but they don't reflect the richness of print citation. We don't understand how to do things like footnotes or endnotes in how we translate them from the paginated sense to the new sense. And yet the reality is probably increasingly now, much of what we write will never see a print. Now, we might put it in a white rectangle on a screen as faux print. And going back to Fred's point about things like two-up display, yes, absolutely. The interesting thing is at what point we step away from the paper representation or faux paper representation being the canonical form of the document to it being some other form. And that transition, I think, is still going on. And we're holding on to paper because it's the best option, in a sense, we have, and the one we culturally understand the most. But once you go into things, like XR, those conventions begin to fall apart. I mean, it's been very interesting. So Tinderbox, Mark Bernstein's current tool, I think now has about 11 different views. It's all the same information, but you can view it in radically different ways. And that's quite interesting. They've mainly been accreted partly out of experimentation, but partly it's a deliberate, essentially academic attempt to try and look at how different presentations of the information can help you with annotation and things like, well, what is a sensible note size? What is a sensible chunk? Now we can talk about things like having addressability at word level, having addressability at paragraph level, but there is some thought here that once you start writing not on a page, what sort of units do you want and for what purpose? Much of what we have now is what we got without asking through our conventions of writing, and that doesn't mean they're bad, not far from it. But there is a question that once we're not basically playing with paper anymore, do the conventions we have help or hinder us? And or more usefully, are there conventions, there are other things that we couldn't do before now that we ought to be embracing with more more enthusiasm, because we can do them in these new mediums, whether in a three-dimensional sense or in just in another two-dimensional display. No, thanks.
Dini, I think you should go first because I'm a little bit off that.
Is anyone speaking?
Dini is trying. She's also having the same button issue.
Oh, okay, fine. I just left a message at Mark's home, and there's nobody in the office.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Dini, hang on. Okay, I'm going to ask you to unmute again. Maybe the button by doing... No, I know you know, but maybe if I do that, it shows a button or something? No? Okay, you'll type, right. Okay, Dini will try again, but I did the strange thing of starting the introduction to the book with a French quote this week. So, Fabien, if you're sitting down, please don't fall off your chair. And it is very much related to what Mark was talking about.
Oh, I love that quote. I use that all the time with my students.
Ah, very good. Because the thing is, very much, your cursor was, yeah, right. So here's the thing, Mark, you're so nail on the head with what I was writing today, because I used the example of one BibTeX citation as being clear text that's computer parsable. As you know, I think everybody does, when you go between reader and author, you paste as that. I didn't invent that, but it means that author knows that this is a clever thing, it's an intelligent thing, it's a unit thing. We don't have that for endnotes, we don't have that for a lot of other things. If we had that, then we could do exactly the things Mark is talking about. So I do think we should really try to not make perfect the enemy of the good.
Hmm.
Yes, we should use full environments. I'm fully happy with that. But I think it's also totally cool to play with a little bit within the sandbox we already have. And the key thing is the clarity of the data so we can do these things. Dini, you are not muted.
Thank God, I just got my cursor back. So I loved Prezi. So you might remember Prezi, some of you. It was one of my favorite alternatives to PowerPoint. And I used them extensively, and the people in the ELIT community were using it for storytelling. It was fantastic. Now it's defunct, right? You can't use it anymore. But sincerely, there's ways of doing this. And I think, Brando, you've talked about this in the past.
Yeah, I absolutely. My suggestions were going to be in line with Prezi, but more modest. But absolutely, Prezi, when done well, is a really great way of identifying structure and relation. You know, one of the challenges with flipping through a book is the lack of context, the
Yeah.
inability to be able to relate things, and the fact that there's only so much proximity that you can kind of convey through a thing that has to obey uh, purely kind of translational uh, uh, dimensions. And so being able to zoom in and out of things gives you the ability to kind of see sort of the fractal structure and relation. You know, it's not the be all and end all. So Prezi is not going to win uh, like all of those sort of struggles because there are shades. You know, there are ways in which there are non-linearities to relations, but definitely. You know, one of the you know you mentioned, Jamie, the fact that type isn't natural. There are a whole bunch of accumulated unnaturalities that are compounded on us as a consequence of the historical direction of text. And one of them is that typesets required uniform type sizes for the most part, if not uniform type widths, which certainly helps with typesetting, but then definitely making sure that you're only using 12-point Courier versus 14 versus 18, and anything that is set in multiple sizes. It becomes so much more expensive to construct. So having this as a semantic signal about the relative importance of things is an absolutely crucial thing. And I would also say that any sort of temporal component, the ability to convey things through the progressive disclosure of things is a really valuable thing. If somebody has an understanding of the experience of somebody. So I think I showed recently my when in Trump's first term, he had some sad and hilarious conversations with the Australian Prime Minister and people, and I turned those back into sort of dot 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 kind of progressive transcripts, so that temporality was kind of reinvigorated and rehydrated. I like that a lot. But yeah, like back to what print was. Another aspect of it is the economies of print, meaning that putting dense regions of text was as much important for the printer as it was for the reader. Now that we have the ability to use white space in the way that is most advantageous for the reader and for comprehension, I think that's something that we should be looking at as well. So, looking, like Danny said, at scale, looking at time, and looking at space. Also, just the sheer space around things, I think, is a really important one. And then taking all of the sort of the care and attention that we have as the general sort of principles behind graphic design and making sure that people have the ability to really imagine what these adjacent possibles are as a of purely digital text. And that to your point, Dini, that's entirely before we get to virtual reality, spatial positioning, and the kind of gestural capabilities we have. So I feel like we just have a lot of work ahead of us.
Yeah, and movement too. I mean, the movement, the way in which it would move, right? It didn't go linear or one at a time. You're swirling around. And some people in my classes would get very dizzy playing with Prezi. Some people took to it like fish in water, right? So I think it's the same as VR experiences. A lot of people are really uncomfortable in the XR environments. It messes with their heads. They need that kind of structure of Euclidean space and predictability, right? There's no, and it's so hard to predict a Prezi. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I also love Prezi. It was really, really brilliant. I'm not next, am I? I didn't even click react. I will. Sorry. Jamie, continue then,
Okay.
Mark.
Okay. Well, I've only seen Prezi in use. I've never used it myself, but I was
Mm.
so impressed when Ben Schneiderman used it years ago at Kai. It was brilliant. I, I I have enough trouble. Well, everyone has trouble using PowerPoint, but I have enough trouble making myself clear in PowerPoint, and I have to, being such a nonlinear thinker, a nonlinear presenter, I find PowerPoint really helps me to focus in a way so that I can say what I need to in a way that I think my audience will get it. Um, I'm not like Mark Anderson, who it's just the presentation of Information Cities and the one the year before were just brilliant in the linearity and yet the graphics and the way everything fit together. I but I have trouble with PowerPoint just getting the typefaces right. You know, you switch, it updates, and suddenly you have the same typefaces, but all your kerning doesn't work anymore, and things are in the wrong places, and oh, it's a mess. But what I wanted to say specifically about this, I two thoughts. One is that we have conventions from text, and these make things much easier. And this more expands on what others have said. In my PhD thesis, I took long articles like Conklin's article about what is hypertext, the encyclopedia length version, and converted it into one single web page and had people read it and then assessed how well the automatic linking was done and so on, and asked a few comprehension questions. I found that the interface style made more of a difference than anything else in that, which led to my later work. And but I chose a single web page because I thought with the elevator scroll bar on the side, people would have a sense of how far they were in the article. As well, I numbered all the sections and started with a table of contents. It, some people did not understand the elevator at all and were completely lost. But so I want to say something about convention. And secondly, I don't have the book here. It's across the hall, I think. But there's an entire, well, there are two books I've got about grammar of graphics and how we present things visually, and that we do have conventions for visual graphics, mostly flat, but some three-dimensional that we could be using to help us explain to people how things work. Part of the problem I imagine with Prezi is there's only so much you can do before you start getting into depth cues and time cues, which are a big issue. But that's what I want to say now, and I'm just gonna go across the hall and look for the book. Deanie, I see your mouth moving. I think you're trying to speak, but you're muted. I do have a copy of the newest edition of Thinking with Type over here, but that's not very helpful for what I want to talk about. I'll come back soon.
Jamie, I wasn't understanding what my cursor disappears for some reason. And it comes back. So Zoom is being weird. But what do you mean by cues? Because in Prezi, you can do automated Prezis. You can queue it like you can a PowerPoint. At least you could back in the day. Can't do it anymore. I mean, I used to make the Prezi presentations for my formal, conference presentations, and it was really great. That and Keynote are my two go-tos.
Mark, I think you can safely go while we're waiting for Jamie.
Okay. I don't know if one of the books Jamie was looking for is this, what he was referring to, grammar graphics, or whether it's Bertin's semiology of graphics is possibly another one. Anyway, point of the hand. Well, one thing some here might know. One thing that's always surprised me is that W3C seems to have taken no interest at all in moving citation. into HTML. So there is a site tag and things like that, but they don't really functionally in any way properly represent the richness that you find in print citation. This seems very strange because it's very, very necessary if you're going to move off the page metaphor into essentially something like HTML. It's interesting too to see as a result that actually publishers are now they're all doing their own thing. So there's some really interesting ways that people are thinking about how you actually, once you have the flexibility of a digital page, you can, for instance, put the references back in a way, both images and things like footnotes, so that they're close to the point being referenced. Because once you have control of the display and you can do more things that a paper page doesn't allow you, you can actually have things appear more usefully close to where they might be wanted by the reader. So that's interesting. But so I have no idea why the HTML sort of caucus have stepped away from that. But it may be in the same way that the BibTeX people claim that BibTeX was designed for print, and all this digital stuff is not really interesting. So I just don't know.
So interesting discussion. And hi, Ken. We're talking about spatial knowledge stuff. Started with StoreSpace, Tinderbox, because we were expecting Mark Bernstein, but he couldn't make it. So on that topic, and following up the few last comments, first of all, the reason we have rectangles is because they're very, very useful. Right. If we go back to, no, I'm not being at all a heretic saying, oh, you're leaving, Dini, already. Okay, see you later, Dini. We could still have cuneiform on little half-rounded things, but then our eyes have to change focus as they read them. So I'm not saying we should stay there, not at all, quite the opposite. But two things. One is when looking at what should be in this spatial kind of thinking environment, to me, it becomes very clear that everything is better than something. Meaning, when you're in there, if you have to kind of import one thing and then you have to go out and it's a different thing, of course, that's bitty. It's a very specific thing. Now that Fabienne has this file access mechanism, it's a really wonderful infrastructure, because ideally, as you're working, doing your triage or your editing or your sculpting, or whatever you're doing, to have access to the entire digital universe of information is more useful. I don't think that is actually something we can say now. That's a reality to us. That's not a 50-year-old thing where that was just a dream. And finally, on this thing, I am in a fun way competing with what Fabienne is doing with my own stuff in native for the vision. And the current thing we're working on, I think, is quite relevant, and that is embedding a 3D sculptural knowledge map inside another, because we've talked so often about how that would work. If there is a link to another one, what happens when you open it? So our current thing that I hope to be able to demo to you next week is, if you execute knowing this is a sub map, then everything in the space goes away. That node stays, and then everything that is in it comes out. In other words, this now becomes a little tab. You can put it anywhere. If you tap on that, then you open up the previous level. It's just so amazing that we're at a point now where we can do these experiments. And this is really on what Fabienne has been suggesting about the FTL in general. What we're aiming to do is not make a thing. We're aiming to provide, and if you guys have any suggestion for external things, tell us, we'll put it on the webpage. I really want people to be able to put on their headset, go to the Future Text Lab, tap on things and experience different interactions to do a few things to learn. We can't compete with the big companies for proper product. But like the idea, Mark has been asking this question a lot. When you open another sculpture or map or whatever in XR, what happens? Now we can start playing. It's just too cool. Anyway, that's it really. So, okay, cut me off because I have things to say, but it's
Okay,
a bit
then
of
I'll cut you off and say about
Okay.
this rectangles. I think we started with rectangles for whatever reason, maybe it was just physical convenience of how paper could be cut or something. And yeah, the codex with bound books was a huge improvement over the scroll. But I think that once we start to see that, we start to imagine this is the only way to do things, that limits us far too much. Now, maybe there are real advantages. I think that it's a problem. I'm guessing that if VR or XR expands beyond where our peripheral vision is, there's too much for us to focus on. Then that is a legitimate problem. But saying that we're limited to rectangles because there's a good reason, I don't think there's necessarily a good reason.
Oh, I'm not saying we should stay with rectangles.
Oh, no. I know you're saying we shouldn't force ourselves to be limited to rectangles.
Yeah, I'm not even saying that. What I'm saying is that different types of texts can benefit from different types of representations. I mean, Brandl, if I remember correct, Brandl, you have a reading environment where it's basically sentence by sentence, right? For some kind of reading. They're very different types of things. And for the whole memory palace thing definitely should have different representations. Absolutely. I was just making quite a small comment earlier that if you have decided yourself to make some textual knowledge for others, once you get to that stage and you're not thinking and editing, having a nice frame. I mean, my background is as an artist, and I remember my first serious art teacher got really annoyed at me because I didn't put a frame on things. She said, at a certain point, you got to frame it, you got to stop it. You can't keep adding to it. So there are many ways of doing that. So yeah, over. Over to Mark Anderson.
Okay, I just quickly think on this thing that, I mean, I wonder if we're carrying an awful lot of baggage from our experience of text most recently as printed on the page, in that tools now, I was thinking to comment that I think it was Freud made and about essentially having sort of more information. Once something's digital, really the boundary blurs. You have a different problem as what's easily findable and bring into the station you want. But whereas if you had something like Codex book, it was either on the page or it had to be maybe in an appendix or a footnote or something. But if it wasn't in the book, it basically wasn't immediately to hand, in the way that in something like hypertext, basically you can link to anything or you transclude it, and you can do that out onto the web or or from some information system. So I find myself thinking that we're stuck with some paradigms of text use that are working against us. In other words, we're sort of thinking about this bit of text is actually still the title of a page, or this bit of text is, in some way it's somehow marred in some other form rather than being a thing of itself. So one of the things that a reflection I've taken from spending 20 odd years using a very hypertextual tool is I'm losing my touch on the linear form, in a sense, because different presentations, I use different presentations of the same information for very particular reasons. So if I'm using something like a map, which is akin in a way to the space that Fabien's created for us, to me, I find that has most power when things are massively abstracted. So to the annoyance of others, I'm thinking about orange circles or pink squares or something, because the textual content that those represented is sort of mapped in here in the moment, because the sort of work I'm doing in those spaces, it tends to be triage work. And this is something I tried to sort of touch on in the short talk I gave at Future of Text. Now that's not everyone's needs, and I don't think they're antipathetic to the some of the, in a sense, the sequential writing and long form text that we do, because those two tasks tend to they're temporarily apart from one another. You don't generally do both those things at once, and if you do, madness ensues. But I do find myself thinking that now we're freed from the page, or even the abstraction of the page, that white rectangle on the screen, that we ought to have more flexibility in the way that we think about things. So even a lot of our terminology for the way we talk about text is in terms of print for very obvious reasons, but I'm beginning to wonder where that's holding us back in places it shouldn't.
So, can you see my view? Oh, am I muted?
Yeah, we can.
Oh, you can. Okay.
Looks good.
So, yeah, it's partly it doesn't look good because now we get into the issues of transparency, occlusion, all of that stuff. So it certainly is cool, and I have to say that being able to walk around changes what this is. This is not really the same as when I was sitting, even though I can do, these things. And I haven't really got a good map to demo now, so we have very little here. But it's a really neat gimmick to have things in space, and to make it readable, it really has to have the frame. But if I go around to the back, there is no frame. Right, so we're onto this, and so please, we need to experiment much more with what we can do with text in space. No question about that. I think we all agree. Let's see if I have another one here. Yeah. It shouldn't all be rectangles, that's for sure. So what does that mean?
I don't have a problem with rectangles, but I think as such, but I don't think we should be limiting ourselves to rectangles initially. I think maybe I've said many times that we learn conventions, we build on conventions. If we took a television ad from now and showed it to people in the 1950s, even if we did it, we removed the color issues and the resolution to make it more like a 1950s technology, I don't think they would understand it, or they wouldn't perceive it the same way. And similarly, when we take a 1950s style ad, I show my students a 1960s ad for an insect repellent, and we do it today. It looks so different. The understanding of it is different. Advertisements now have lots of very quick cuts. We have montage techniques that we weren't recognized before. With the medium is the message, and
Jamie,
but if we can start,
I think we agree on that. Just to be clear, very much.
oh, I'm sorry.
No. I don't think we're arguing against. I think the question is just now that we have this capability, what coolness and usefulness can we do with it?
Yeah, I think it's a question of whether we just do cool things for ourselves and maybe one or two other people who we're collaborating closely with, or we start with something that's more well-known and conventional and see how things develop after that. But
So what would
yes,
be an
opposed
example of that?
Yeah. Do you want an example?
No, yeah, no, if you have one of, I mean, the quote, the French quote that you and I like so very much is, actually, you know what? For the benefit.
I like the idea of building things on top of or beside of or somehow extending things we're familiar with. So a lot of my earlier work was about taking the good things from paper and the good things from digital and somehow putting them together, making digital systems more like paper. It's easy to search for some exact thing digitally, but if it's on paper, it's less permanent, but it's easier to make notes on paper. It has a certain tactility. You can fold it. You can have interactions with it that you can't have with the digital. But of course, paper is much more easily destroyed, whereas the digital presumably stays forever. So somebody wrote in the chat, which has disappeared on my screen, about doing XR with rectangles of paper. as an extension or an additional layer. I like that as a way to start.
I think Ken has comments on that. You're the third person who is taking time, Ken, today
No,
to do
it's
the
just that
unmute.
my computer windows needed to move aside so I could hit my mute button.
It's just
So
fascinating. No, it's happened to a lot of us today. So I'm just wondering if it's an
I
update
think
or
it's just
something.
because all the rectangles confuse me.
Don't blame the rectangles.
So I wanted to point out that building on what Jamie said, which I completely agree with, in 1968, the original movie, The Thomas Crown Affair, came out with Steve McQueen and Faye Dunaway. A really great movie, but you watch it now and it's kind of nuts because it was 1968 and everybody believed that the future was using zooms because now we could do continuous zooms. And they're only shot with continuous zooms and split screen and all these fancy things. And now we watch it and we're like, what the hell drug were they on? And eventually people figured out that these things were not helpful. I mean, montage is great, and that has, of course, continued. But people try new things, and sometimes it turns out that they map really well to the human physiological system of how we receive information and process it. And sometimes it just doesn't work. So I mean, there have been many movements in architecture, as we all know, to try to move away from rectangles, and mostly they fail. And there's something about the way we deal with north, south, east, west, and right angles, and organization, and furniture, and everything, and paper that there seems to be something going on there that has to do with something about the way we work inherently, not an accident of somebody made a technological decision. Because people do try all sorts of things. So I don't want to sort of say we must break out of the tyranny of the rectangle without really kind of thinking about what's going on here and what has been happening and where does this come from. I just wanted to add that.
Thank you, Peter.
Okay, the discussion just a hair back reminded me of David Small's work at MIT. I wonder if anyone knows whatever became of it. Did anyone pick up on that thread? I think he moved off into private architectural practice or something. Haven't seen him surfacing anywhere in public lately.
I'm not sure. If anyone has any thoughts on that, please put it in. Brandel, I can wait. Please go ahead.
I wanted to echo Ken's point about the fact that while the technology has the ability to change, sort of the extent and the structure of human attention kind of doesn't. And one of the things that we often, it sounds like, I haven't seen the 68 Thomas Crown. I made a note to watch it. It sounds fun. We get these wild ideas of what is going to sort of make sense for us, what kinds of ways we'll be able to kind of construct reading or legibility, and there's an exuberance that really does need to calm down at some point. So we like something that I read a while ago that I really liked about writing is that writing is a technology, as we all sort of know. Sometimes it blows people's minds to realize that, but unlike a lot of other technologies, it's not to do with like its peculiarities are not to do with as much to do with things like the material substrate. So like the invention of the space, the invention of punctuation, these are more to do with human attention and the sort of human cognitive capacity to use things and to leverage them. There's definitely a tension, right, between the technological kind of underpinnings of it. Movable type was really useful, something, but most of the way along, it's been the substrate that it's been matching against is actually the human attentional capacity, rather than to do with discovering new kind of polymer steel structures or trusses that allow you to span great distances. The distances that are being spanned are the intentional ones that relate to how we can understand this thing and that thing and put them together and flow between them without getting lost. And so to that end, I mean, at some level, I wanted to sort of say a lot of the innovations are going to be more modest, certainly in the short term, as people act in the sort of the transitional capacity between this and that, and the kind of the tyranny of the printed page. The Printocene, as I heard some folks mention in the room, is one that's going to cast a pretty long shadow. But I also think that it means that it's not the improvement is not a fixed target, because we're all coming to it from slightly different perspectives, intergenerationally and things. So I do think that as we kind of discover things, even if they're not right, then it may just be that they're not right now. And I look forward to being able to kind of point people to directions that can be kind of pulled on in subsequent future iterations, generations of hardware, software, and kind of psychology. Yeah.
I'm making a suggestion that we ban, just like we pretty much banned discussions of PDF versus HTML early on in our community, we ban discussions on rectangle versus non-rectangle, because it makes no sense, because we all agree. We should use the space. Sometimes we need a rectangle. So I think it's kind of boring, but I mean, if someone disagrees, obviously, please tell me. But what I would really like to hear is a discussion around what things should be in space and how should we interact with them. But I think Mark has a point before we get to that. Please go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, it's not a total disagreement with the last point, but I think it's mischaracterizing it. I think I tried to capture it before. The point is that the issue of rectangles is not rectangles or not rectangles. It's the degree to which we're using rectangles as a faux page. In other words, we're thinking in print, but we're not being honest that we're not using print. I think that is valuable to talk about. I totally get the point that yes, you can get bound up with rectangles or not. But as I think I made another comment, I mean, having a bounded space in an unbounded space of XR is useful. If only to, said, beyond this point, here be dragons. But so I don't think trying to turn it into a rectangles versus something else thing, I think is premature and probably limiting on the discussion. The issue that I think what we're trying to do is to move out of the shadow of our experience of print, which is hard because it lies so heavily upon us.
Yeah,
but it's constraining some of the things we're trying to do now.
Yeah, but Mark, it's kind of continuously brought up that we need to move out of the shadow of print. We all here agree we need to do that. So I think reflecting on that may in itself limit our thinking. So for instance, when I showed you guys the very, very basic thing that we have in Author now in XR, in one level, it's absolutely fantastic. How is it even possible? Sci-fi level of wow. On another level, it is really, really mundane, right? It's just the very, very beginning. And it contrasts very much with what Fabienne, Ken, and Brandel have been doing, because it is AR rather than VR. I find VR, as long as you know a little bit of your space, to be much, much better, much more clearer. But I would really like to know what kind of stuff, because Jamie, you hinted on this earlier, what kind of stuff should we put in this space? Because for me, it's a bit intellectually stressful to have built this basic thing and have no idea, to be honest, what should be in it other than everything. What are your thoughts?
I was just typing that to ask, maybe it would make sense to create individual things, like I guess I could call them a document, in a form that we thought made sense for what we were trying to do, rather than making something general at the beginning. So like, I was thinking of the traditional printing of Talmud, from like the 1200s or so in Italy, where there's a main text, it's a rectangle. main text in the middle and commentaries on the outside with specific sections of the page reserved for specific commentators. And then in between and in the margins, cross references or notations to find things. And I don't know who originally came up with the idea, but it's very popular for even in totally English translation of Talmud to do things this way. But I don't think it would be appropriate for everything. And years ago, in that 6-year study of annotation I did, well, I was part of, I took extra large pages and I put articles where I chopped up the paragraphs in the middle of the page, and I put ancillary material around the outside. Sometimes sometimes lined up with the text, sometimes sideways, sometimes at some angle in between, sometimes with lines between them. Whatever seemed to me to make sense to explain what I needed to for my students to read it. And then after doing this for a year or two, I started this study where we saw how we started to see how students used it. And I made some changes to the documents because there were some things that they were confused by. But I didn't say this is the general way to do layout, and I did it with 2 or 3 articles. And each one was different. Maybe we should start that way.
Are you thinking about a specific text?
In that case, they were texts from printed works. There was one from an early issue of ACM Interactions where they had already laid out the text slightly like Wired Magazine, where it wasn't necessarily top to bottom, left to right. And another one, it was from a book where blocks of paragraphs were interrupted by images. And I took text from different parts of chapters and stuck them together. Sometimes the illustrations were on the side with an expansion on another page. Sometimes the images were simply not there. Because also these were students who hadn't been exposed to hypertext, many of them in any way at all, except the web in its most conventional form. But I think we would start from something we were interested in doing. What would we want to have? Even like I do a lot of lists for shopping for things and trying to decide whatever product it is I would want to buy, or how to fix something, keeping in mind a budget.
Yeah, we did do reading last year where we had our book and the hypertext of that year available in a reading environment, which is still very functional. And Rob had the beautiful language of a volume, which I believe is partly why Fabienne is showing the volume here.
Of the cube.
Yeah, which happens to be a cube in this. But yeah,
I just wanted to be clear what it was.
Yeah, but we are talking about authoring and reading and editing and communicating. Text is so many different things, which is part of the great point. So, Brendel, what do you think?
I was going to talk about rubric. So first of all, back to like early modern or medieval Italians, because they're cool. One of the things that helped the merchant class in Italy from the 13th century onward was their adoption of a rubric in notebooks to structure their purchases and sales, their profits and loss, in a way that was able to formalize them to a degree that was just head and shoulders over absolutely everybody else in Europe, and was able to kind of cement a benefit there. And the word rubric today means a similar thing of scoring, assessment, and a formalism that we impose over things for the benefit of having a common understanding of them. Something that I think is funny is that the word rubric literally means red letters, right? It's these conventions that were introduced as a consequence of having certain technical capabilities and then kind of leveraging them. And as the red ink fell by the wayside because it was too difficult to do a two-pass process and these things where have somebody hand illustrate them in the movable type stuff, then rubric just meant the formalism rather than the literal red letters that you used to structure it. Something that I find really challenging, and back to my earlier point about it, advancements may not make sense right now, but they may make sense eventually, is that at least as much of communication, because it's between multiple people and because it needs to be kind of to your point, Jamie, like for its own sake or for the specific thing rather than having a sort of generic mechanical exercise. You need to have time. You need to have formalisms kind of be mutually meaningful in order for people to be able to understand whether they carry any cognitive benefits. And so it can be really difficult, as much as Fabiana and I enjoy playing with things, and Carl, your text input, like it is very, very difficult to look at these things because we know that Dvorak could have won, but it didn't. We actually have a real sort of dueling challenge between the stability that sort of is necessitated by mutual intelligibility of these things and the opportunity to undertake these grand experiments of what if we print off the side of the page, or what if we make it so that a book is a single page, but you're just zooming into the different landforms of the chapters. There's merit to it, but it's sorry.
Sorry, no. You just reminded me of stretch text, which is something I really love. And there was, I don't remember if it was at Kai or was it Hypertext. I think it might have, where there was a story, a children's story in stretch text. And it reminds me of The Only Thing I Like by Neil Stephenson, Diamond Age, with the stretch text of the story. But until you said that, it struck me. I kept thinking about the NATO conference from Educational Hypermedia, I think from 1990, that Jakob Nielsen was at, and they produced a revised proceedings where every author read everybody else's and then put in their own cross references in a printed book form using I guess you'd call it a taxonomy of what link types they could use, and it was terrible. I mean, it sounded like a good idea. They put what seemed like reasonable guardrails into it. And yet, as a PhD student, I think, or maybe a master's student, I don't know, it was awful. It's like nobody read anybody else's, or I guess some people did. But when it said, see page 19 for this, you couldn't tell where in page 19 you were supposed to start reading and when you were supposed to stop. Because there were jumping off points, but there weren't on this page. This is where you begin. This is where you end. Now, I did something like that with a textbook that was designing the user. No, it's not designing the user interface. It's by Clayton Lewis and I think John Ryman. A book was available in text as here's how we teach our HCI class from decades ago now. And I made a PDF version with notes in the margins and cross-references and an index. And it was more to teach myself more about LaTeX or LaTeX than anything else. But I found it really helpful. And I put in start and end points for where sections were. And I like to think that it was helpful. And it followed a lot of conventions. But again, I think I'm not sure that I'm right. I don't want to give the impression that I know everything. I'm sure everybody knows that I don't. But that we need that maybe if we try things, we'll be able to see what works, what sticks. We can't. I heard that the earliest editions of issues of Wired magazine were too outre for most people to understand, and they became more conventional in later years. But still, the idea of trying something new, seeing what works, what doesn't, without limiting ourselves too much at the beginning. Not that I'm necessary, and I don't think I'm the best person for this because I'm creative though I am. I'm not as creative as many other people. And when I think of ideas, I generally think of a main text and ancillary material. I don't think in terms of Prezi, which I think is, when I've seen good Prezis, they're fantastic. But I don't see myself as the kind of person who would make one.
Yeah. I think that's a good point, Jamie. And annotations is definitely, that's obviously the language varies a lot, but in our community with this dialogue, annotation is basically everything. It's a gloss. It's thing that isn't in the original. So absolutely.
Oh,
two things.
well, just while I remember, saying gloss reminded me of my big glossary thing from years ago, which I thought was very important, and Hypertext didn't accept it as a paper. That one of the ideas is, as people read multiple documents, they take notes in what we could call a rubric. I called it a structured glossary. And they then make meta categories in that. And there were, of the many dimensions or anatomies I thought of for these glossaries, there could be floating and there could be tied. If it's tied, it would be for one text. If it's floating, it's like a commonplace book that people would take their own notes in and they would use it for their entire collection of books. And maybe that's a tool which would apply to multiple documents, and that would be a good thing to do in XR.
Yeah, we have been looking at different ways of where is an annotation. Fabian has developed an annotated bibliography system with Dini, where annotations are partly writing in space. I understand connected or not connected, but also literally pulling sections out for annotation. So since we're getting close to end time and Brandel's going to go on, two things. First of all, I beg of you to write me a paragraph, just a paragraph for inclusion in the book. I put it here in the text, but I'll read it anyway. I wanted to start with, when I put on a headset, I want to be able to reach out and touch XXX, and I want to be able to do YYY with it. Something very, very concrete. I would love that. We'll have a separate section for that, if you could please do that. Secondly, if Fabian doesn't mind, after Brandel's comment, if we could look properly at what we posted in the beginning, I think that would be useful for everyone, because it's kind of amazing. Is that cool with you, Fabian? Cool. I will go into the headset and look at it and share after Brandel.
Fantastic. My apologies for going on, but I intend to. One of the things that in talking about these things and also tying it back, as I was earlier, to attention, I think that a lot of people, particularly academics and intellectuals who have the ability to kind of reason about text kind of on its own terms, we can be somewhat inured to the apparent impacts of the kind of the space, the real estate, and the attentional characteristics of the environment that we're doing this work within. I was talking to somebody recently about an article in The Economist that I actually didn't read, but I read the person's paper that the Economist article was about, and I thought that article for that person was going to be a better primer for it. But I didn't want to buy a sub to The Economist because I didn't like the idea of reading it on my phone. I don't feel like that there's the intersection of how I would like to feel while I was reading it would match up with it well. And so yeah, I think that the human factors, the kind of the relative poverty of reading things on phones, the kinds of attentional cues that come from, at best, being on a laptop screen for the most part, are ones that are particularly difficult to kind of match with the idea of adding these kinds of deictic kind of complexity, these indexicals between and across documents and things like that. So something that and like you were saying, Jamie, about having introduced some people to some of the macOS Finder stuff, like if people can't kind of even countenance the intention, the purpose of those things, then it can be pretty bleak to go like, you expect me to attend to what? So I do hope that if nothing else, if we can get, more computer hardware manufacturers to make more iPads for your face, then we can start to kind of relax a little and not feel the relative poverty of the display, having requiring every last pixel on an iPhone size thing to be devoted to something for its own sake, and to start to relax a little into adding some relations. I'd like that. Anyway.
Brandel, it's interesting you said that. I was reading an article on New Scientist on my phone today, which I'm showing now. Oh, could somebody mute, please? There's a lot of echo. It might be me, actually. Hang on, let me just make this dark and turn this down. When you read an article, even on New Scientist, which is clearly a serious publication, you can't search on the page. And as you pointed out, Brandel, you can search on a web page, but most people don't know how to do that. So this is really weird reading environment. Right, so this is an article in the navigation space. Oh, you have to give me a new link, Fabienne. What did I do? Is this the right... Sorry.
Hard for me to see.
Yeah, you can't see it at all, can you? Hang on. Can you give it to me in
He's got
Zoom?
And
he
got a 502.
Hmm?
He got a 502, so it could be cookies, or it could be argument parameters, meaning that it's making the request funny.
So what I had was here. Oh, no, that didn't copy across. Copy. Paste. No, it's doing the same thing. It's very odd because when I tried to do it on our web page, it seemed to work. Sorry. Authorship. I go here. This is the directories navigation space.
No, but I think something is off, because even like an unrelated link, like I shared something in the chat before, doesn't work.
When I disconnected, I was looking at it in another tab, and I was having trouble getting it to understanding the controls, but I was definitely using it. And then I thought I was closing the tab, but I actually closed this window instead.
Fabienne, I tried it from the original link again, and it doesn't load, so I'm sorry about that. But I can't.
What happened to me was I got to the code, and then I had to go up to the project, and then from the project I went to the demo.
Yeah, no, it doesn't work, but we can, yeah. This is the reality of stuff, isn't it, guys? Did you want to maybe speak something about it, Fabienne, since we can't view it for whatever reason?
Yeah, there's a video there.
Yeah, so instead, but it's not, I don't think it's the same content you had in mind. I'm not sure which one you had in mind, but...
Your article in the directory.
Yeah. Let me see if at least there is a screenshot for it as a backup. Doesn't look like. Well, it will be something else entirely. So yes, if you open the video in the chat, you can see the idea is to bridge. Actually, I see a typo in the title. So it's bridging WebXR. So any of the experience we have basically. With a chatbot, the idea being that not everybody wants to be in WebXR or WinXR even at all, but they might already have chat client like Signal or Delta Chat, and then you can send messages to that person, again, without touching anything related to 3D. The principle is, if you do have, for now it's just text, but you can imagine, of course, sending files. You don't have the person to have to go through, let's say, a form to upload anything or drag and drop, and then we can make that richer. We can keep on chatting, let's say, to the person without wanting necessarily to have anything related to the spatial aspect of it. If somebody is not into this, but they still want to participate, let's say, into tagging where things, let's say, to categories, and then the person in the headset can then interact with them through chat or maybe something else. Delta Chat is also, if you're not familiar with it, it's a chat software that is of course open source, and the backend of it is a mail server. So the chats are chats are basically the equivalent of email, and you can piggyback on existing mail server infrastructure or set one up. So it's pretty lightweight and yet quite very flexible, actually.
So in closing then, maybe we schedule next Monday to be an update on what you have, Fabian, because I got an email from Mark Bernstein. He's been basically frozen out. So there's weather-related issues. So we'll reschedule him. But I feel that I apologize. Your presentations and your work has been very choppy today for that reason, because we weren't really sure where we were. So let's schedule a proper end-of-year update on Fabian Magic. I think that would be useful. Is that useful for you guys next Monday? Well, Peter likes it. Does Fabian like it? Let's see now.
Yeah, sure. There is always more stuff to show and to discuss, so no problem.
Okay, very good. And also,
I can tell from a little like behind the scene, like somebody uploaded a large PDF apparently not so long ago, so probably during the meeting, and then some of the files about a spatial book blew up the server. So I think that's why like a service has to be restarted.
Oh, I uploaded a single PDF page.
It's probably not that.
Okay.
yeah, so guys, please do that paragraph for me, or double sentence, or something short. In some of the previous books, we've had really, really short bits from people, like a sentence. This could be something like that. But I think we need to, Jamie already did it. He said, you know, he wants to be able to do what in some language is a gloss or an annotation in relation to another one. That's really, really valuable. Now there's, just reading your comments, guys. Yeah, the Churchill war rooms, that's a really good point, actually. 1 second. I've shown you guys these, right? Have you all seen these?
I haven't.
These are from Duxford, World War II control center. These were put on the map, and I can't remember what the numbers mean, but I believe HO6, that's the unit, and 50 plus, that's the amount of baddies there are. They're also color coded to show how in or out of date they are. The colors change every 15 minutes on a rotating clock. You know, well, all clocks rotated, but you can see by what color how old the data is. I'm so glad that you brought that up here, Jonathan, because we may start looking at these types of things to represent things in this world. It's, you know, Mark has been talking about spheres just as to get us going. Maybe very useful. Fabian, yes, you get the last word today.
We're back online, so I will investigate a bit what was special about it.
Okay.
But the link is in the chat also if you want to check in or out of VR. It is, to give a little bit more context, it is unrelated to chat with Delta Chat and how to collaborate there. It is basically formatting the little text I'm suggesting for the book. Because I knew it would be a little bit silly to just, I literally send, so you don't want to know honestly all this, but I sent for the literal plain text file, so a .txt, nothing fancy in it, because I think the content there makes sense. But of course, it would be a bit silly to do this while having a whole immersive environment and authoring XR. And basically, I split that .txt file in 3 or 4 .txt files in a directory. And the idea is you display that directory, and the content has a certain layout. which are basically trying to tell the story of the document through the position of those sections of the plain text document in space. And you can see a little bit also behind the scene the .extra auto enter.json. So that applies the layout when you enter that directory. Yeah. So
Okay,
it means
so-
now the document is spatial.
So I'm actually here. Brandel, are you also coming in? Because you have the same kind of headset, that's what I'm wondering.
It's not network, just so you know, though you won't see each other in that
Yes,
experience.
no, absolutely, and that's worth saying to the group. The networking is a separately being built things, but you know, the whole discussion of rectangles or not, they're rectangles but transparent, so to speak, just since we talked about it, but it is actually compelling and not messy. Right, and this, shall I tap on this? Boom, now the file system moved over there because we're in a subdirectory. So these, I'm not sure if Rob is still with us in the meeting now, but if you can tell, we are inside cubes. Right, so each cube is a directory level. So as we go further down, everything shifts to the left. So if I could walk, but I don't want to do it because I'll hit it, you know, I'll hit the wall. It's there. And we
Just
have this.
to highlight, if you pinch on the first letter, you should be able to move it. It can be saved also after. And here it's just like it was a single .txt file, which also for the fun of it during the meeting, I made a .stxt file. So for spatial text, the idea that you can have the directory if you want, let's say for a big document, an entire book. But if it's here, like, I don't know, 30 lines, or less, you probably want a single file for this, but you might want spatial information is that inside that plain text file. So you can also have that as a, let's say, lighter format. But the whole point about directories is you have a set of files and you can have subdirectories, and you can have subdirectories in your subdirectories. So the whole file system, its hierarchy, that's the whole power there. So if you can navigate by physically moving into it or move anything aside, then I think there is a lot of mileage into what can be there explored.
I just need to add one thing, and I thank for those of you who are still here, thank you. This weird, simple background room is really, really compelling, partly for what it isn't. Right now, it is useful only in a sense of orientation, but it doesn't have any informational capabilities. So I'm not saying this is the ideal shape at all, but for us to really start playing with it, like maybe this rectangle I should be able to put up there to use later and so on. All these obvious things, when you're in here, whether you use Meta or Apple or whatever headset, please go in. This is one of the most compelling experiences we have. And to me, the number one thing it communicates is the depth of our ignorance about what this can be. It literally is the first, as Rob would say, scratches on paper, maybe. It's wonderful.
One quick note also is that there was no JavaScript or whatever code involved in this. So it means a person, yes, JSON is a bit strict. If you mess up a quote, it won't work, but there is no programming. There is no paradigm to understand or anything like this. Like you type things, or as Freud, you were saying, you can move them once you're in the space, but before the space, files in directory, editing those files, no programming.
A question, the way the bits of text were spaced, how was that done? How was that told to the system to do it and to keep it?
I'm trying to understand the way to do what?
We had a few blocks of text in the space.
Yep.
They weren't
Yep.
just in a list. How would the author or user, so to speak, be able to do that? Because you can't just put a plain text file in a directory and expect it to show up like that, or can you? How does that work?
Well, I mean, you can, but they're going to be like aligned. There is no layout here with a little bit of angles and whatnot. So the auto enter JSON file is to give that specific layout. The files are split. It was initially a single text file, the .txt plain text file, but then I split it into 3 or 4 files. But then that's why the new special TXT that is like 3 hours old format or 2 hours old, I forgot, is try to like the user doesn't have then to split the plain text files into multiple ones.
Did you say
based on
spatial format?
Yes, STXT.
Please give us whatever specification that is, and let's continue having a jolly good discussion around that. Anyway, we're way over time. I really appreciate today. We'll figure out Mark Bernstein, and next week will be more in-depth Fabienne, and please send that little bit of text, okay?
Have a great
Please
week.
do.
Happy coding.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Bye for now.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.